2. Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another Cosmos webinar. I'm your host here today. My name is Jonas Roslin. I'm the Director of Community for the Cosmos community. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section. I would love to handle those afterwards at the end of the presentation. Or if you have any urgent questions, we might talk about those during as well. Joining me today is Merv Adrian, founder and principal of IT Market Strategy. Hi, Merv.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
So Merv will talk about optimizing your architecture for AI innovation. Thank you so much for being here, Merv, and I'll leave you to it.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to talk about this topic. Obviously, there are a few things that are hotter right now in the market. I don't think I have to spend too much time explaining that to anybody, but it is worth taking a very specific perspective on it. And that is that unlike many of the innovative data and IT architecture themes that we've seen over the last few decades while I've been at this analyst gig, this one is really being driven very much by the board. Very, very high level involvement. Everyone is eager to find out what they can do in their organization to ensure that they're not left behind, they're not outflanked by their competitors. And you see here from a survey that's not the one we're going to spend the rest of this presentation on, but done by my colleagues at BARC in August of 2023, they talked to a bunch of board members. And what they found was mandates coming from the board to do research and development into AI were already at 28%. My favorite one on this slide, frankly, is the one that just popped up with the dollar signs. When the board comes to you saying, we want to spend some money, you don't say no. And organizations have been scrambling because instead of going into the cycle of how do we build the justification, decide how much we want to spend and go ask for it, they literally have board members coming to them with bags of money in their hands going, please spend this money and let's get into this. So it's a hot topic, and I got together with my friends and colleagues at BARC. This is before I became a BARC fellow. This was just a project that we chose to do together. My old friend Sean Rogers and I decided to do some primary research. I don't know about you, but I get a little tired of the punditry and all the opinion mongering, and I like to go out and get some real data before I talk about this stuff. So we put together a survey to try to understand what organizations are doing, how they're planning to do it, how they're organizing in order to get ready for using AI in their organization. We went high, as you can see the titles here, VP levels. There's some seniors, directors and managers and engineers, and even an analyst or two, because being one myself, I like to hear from them. We got 335 respondents across a variety of different geographies, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But the presentation I'm going to go through now is based on that report, and at the end, I'll give you a QR code. You can also follow up with us if you'd like, in order to get a copy of the full report. We can't cover anywhere near everything that was done here. But look, here's the first message. It's not too late. I've been surprised at the number of people that tell me how concerned they are that they're falling behind. Well, you know, you could have started 6 months ago, and if you stopped innovating in the second 3 months, you'd already be behind, because things are happening very, very fast here. Technologies are emerging, technologies are being validated, technologies are showing themselves to be unsuitable. So no, don't rush, and don't get into FOMO, for those of you who don't know, fear of missing out. That's a great way to fail fast, and some companies want to fail fast. It's a technique. But you know, these are big investments, and they tend to be significantly disruptive architecturally and organizationally. So take your time and get it right. The train has not left the station yet, and think through your strategy in a way that will de-risk it. There are significant possible risks associated with AI, and we'll talk a little bit about it. And one place to think very carefully about is who is going to work with you on this. And what you're going to find is virtually every vendor you're already dealing with is in the thick of this, either from a marketing perspective, all of them are doing that, or they actually have done some work. And if you've got trusted suppliers, that is always the best place to start. Don't introduce unknown players who you haven't worked with before if the trusted vendors you already have can answer your questions, can supply the needs you've got. That's a very good way to de-risk early. Later on, perhaps you'll play with some innovative guys you haven't worked with before, but you may not need to do that. And very, very importantly, find the expertise in your organization. You may discover that a lot of those folks are taking their spare time to figure out what's going on in AI, and they know a lot more than you think they do. And if not, you need to start thinking about where you're going to hire, and that's going to be a very important success factor for you. So a quick look at the data. As I said, 335 organizations participated around the world, different geographies. We got a good mix of industries. In fact, after our first drop of the survey, we decided we were a little short in a couple of them, and we sent a second drop out using an additional mailing list in order to be able to do a little bit of comparability analysis, which I won't go into in much detail here. Some of it is in the survey, and some of it, of course, you can follow up with us to ask further questions if you're looking for certain kinds of crosstabs. It's a good mix of sizes. Well over a third were companies smaller than 500 employees, and nearly a quarter of them were very large companies with 5,000 or more. All of these organizations take different approaches to implementing a new technology and a new product based upon the resources they have available. And it's important to understand those differences. So we wanted to ensure we had a lot of coverage by different sizes. So where we started was in identifying 7 areas that we consider key readiness dimensions. And you can see them down the left-hand side of this slide. What are your standards for security and complying with those standards, legal considerations, and so on? I'm not going to read all of these to you, but you'll notice that they're ranked in terms of how people classified their own readiness. They could say, we're not even talking about it. We're consulting our stakeholders and beginning to research. We're already drafting policy, or the 2 highest categories, which we combined for this analysis. We have either formalized or we are reviewing and revising a plan that we already have. We decided to combine those because it turned out that it was very interesting to look at that particular set. It turned out that of the 335 participants in this survey, 69 of them ranked themselves as either formalizing or reviewing those 7 categories. After we got our first pass of the research back and the quants had done some work for us and crunched out some charts, we looked at that and said, you know, that is a sub-cohort that we ought to look at. We decided to call them the high readiness players. It's 20% of the total. And one can easily see that those folks probably see the landscape a little differently because they've already gotten over the first hills. They have some experience. We were not requiring our participants to be people who had completed their first project. That, as it happens, is the next research project we're doing, and that survey is about to be fielded. And that'll give us an opportunity to compare a real field experience with what people thought about at the beginning of this year. This survey was fielded in the first quarter. So this is very fresh data. We're very interested in learning what they've learned. And here's one thing we've learned already. Don't rely on AI too much. You see this picture you're looking at? It was generated. It's not a photograph. We asked AI to create it for us. And it's spelled high wrong, you notice. And it's spelled high wrong even though we made 2 attempts to actually correct it. We weren't unable to do so. I know a lot of people's first experience with LLMs, with ChatGPT and the like mine, probably was to go ask it about yourself. and what you got back was stuff that was wrong. And we quickly came up with the term hallucinations to describe that. That's not a solved problem, and we're going to talk about some of the technologies that people are implementing to attempt to correct for that. But there's still plenty of work to do to get that right. So there are a lot of questions in the survey. The full report contains them all. And I've decided to highlight 5 very specific ones that gave us some particular insights and that I think are especially important for people beginning their journey. So, what are the obstacles that people anticipated or have already seen? And which technologies are they going after already, either exploring or implementing? How do they feel about responsible AI? Something we believe very strongly in. How are they going to measure success? And anytime you're entering a new technology area and deploying new projects, understanding what you mean by success is very important, and having the instrumentation in place to actually do that measurement, including the progress and the milestones, but also the response, the reaction, the need for correction. That's something you have to build in from the beginning. And when we're in a hurry, sometimes that's one of the things we leave out. And then finally, we were particularly interested in seeing what's going on with what's next after large language models. If you look at the coverage of this space right now, how many billion items are in your LLMs is something that a lot of vendors are competing about, and it's a measure of how rich it can be, and everybody's very excited about it. But it turns out that being more specific and focusing on a particular domain for your language model can have a great deal of value, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's jump right in here. And ask, what are people seeing as obstacles? And here I've only shown the overall response to this. In later slides, I'm going to show you the difference between the overall numbers and those high readiness people, or leaders if you prefer. The reason that I didn't make that distinction here was that largely the responses were the same here. These are the things people are concerned about, and they're not unusual. For technology introduction, we don't have the skills. It's very typical. How is it going to integrate with the rest of my environment? What are we going to do about indemnification and trust and so on? Some of these were a little surprising. It was interesting to see how few people already, so far, have not identified or haven't prioritized data quality. This is a very data-centric audience, as I am myself, and there is nothing more important, I think, than the data that's going to go into these models. Garbage in, garbage out has never been more true, and that does need to be a focus. But the biggest surprise here in the differences between that leadership cohort that I talked about and everybody else was the fact that for them, what was number 2 for everybody was number 1, and that is high costs. They've already done a little work, and what they've identified in their early work is this thing is not going to be cheap. The marketing may make it sound pretty simple. Sign on, the stuff's in the cloud, start asking some questions and watch the magic happen. Well, yeah, but there's going to be a lot of cost here. And even though the board may be standing there with a bag of money in its hand, asking you to do the work, you need to think very carefully about what your budget looks like and where you're going to allocate it. Which brings us, of course, to what technologies are people adopting. So now I'm using a convention that I'll use for the next several slides, which is that light colored bar represents the responses from those folks we identified as high readiness, or here they're labeled leaders. I'm not that thrilled with that label. That's the one we've got. But you'll see that the ranking, again, doesn't change very much, but the magnitude is enormous. Those folks out in front have already seen it's going to be very important to get the right kind of hardware to run this stuff on. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who's looking at the marketplace. It's no accident that NVIDIA is one of the most successful hardware companies to introduce products in the last couple of decades, because that's what they do. But everywhere you look, if you're using a cloud provider, your cloud provider may be introducing their own specific chips to run these models on, and so on. Also good to see that the leaders have figured out very early on that they need ops. They need an understanding of how do we run this stuff? How do we manage and monitor it in operation? Very important. The good news is that actually was number one among everybody. That was very encouraging. It suggests that people who are thinking about this have looked down the road a little bit beyond the pilot and understand they're going to have to get these things right. Very high on the list, not surprisingly, is knowledge graphs, because those things are going to be very critical to supplying whatever method we use to avoid hallucinations. And then, of course, getting the right set of foundational models. Those are probably the LLMs, but as we're going to say in a few minutes, some very domain-specific ones as well. I won't go through all the others here, but I'll point out one or two that surprised me. And personally, I was quite surprised to see vector databases at the bottom of the list, because I think a lot of people have already figured out how important that's going to be. And in particular, for what we call retrieval assisted generation for generative models, RAG. That's where we're going to connect back to the knowledge graph that's going to inform the model and ensure that it doesn't go down the wrong paths. In any case, we won't spend too much time on this one because time is limited, but I wanted to make sure that we covered that particular category. So next is, what are you doing about responsible AI? This is really, really important. Most organizations, appropriately, are approaching this with a significant amount of caution, but they're not quite sure exactly how to be cautious and what things they need to do to ensure that they are responsible. You need to have established some very clear guidelines for your organization in the area of even at a content level, things like bias in your models. They sound very technical, but they could not be more important. Regulatory issues will crop up very soon. In fact, they already have, certainly in Europe. We already have significant regulation happening. If your plans haven't been very clear about how you're going to comply, if you haven't thought about the transparency of the architecture you're building, its auditability, its observability, its explainability, you're going to have a real problem when the regulators come calling and ask you why something happened. So compliance came quite high, although not as high as just overall security. Everybody is concerned about being hacked, clearly. Data privacy, these things all kind of tie together very well. Rather surprisingly, risk management and indemnification are kind of far down the chart. That one surprises me a bit because the risk issue is going to be significant. And I've talked to a lot of the key vendors. In fact, a few days ago in New York, talking to IBM, all their models are indemnified, and most vendors' models are indemnified. It's really important that you have that assurance that if there is a problem, that you don't get the coat of arms problem, we used to call it, the pointing fingers crossed in both directions. We need to know how this happened, and we need to be indemnified against problems. It is interesting that the leaders are less focused on human AI collaboration than the overall set. In fact, it was the number 2 in the general population. Intriguing. And I think that's because one of the first places people encounter this technology is when they start thinking about a really hot topic 6 or 7 months ago, which is prompt engineering. Perhaps a little less so today. Everybody's thinking about, how do I talk to this thing? It's conversational. How do we ask the right questions to ensure that we get the right answers? And how that collaboration takes place is going to be very important. But I think that a lot of the leaders, in a few conversations I've had with people who took the survey and were willing to chat a little bit about some of their thoughts, a lot of people kind of think that the conversational model is already working pretty well. That is, the nature of the dialogue with whatever the UI looks like is working reasonably well. Natural language interfaces seem to be, in many people's mind, a solved problem until you get to highly specialized things, and that's a more technical problem to challenge us with. So, how do you measure success? Not surprisingly, based on the answer to the previous question that I showed you, the leaders said, well, we better keep the costs under control. We need to make sure that we get it in under budget and all that stuff. And it's going to have to perform well. That's not a surprise. Interestingly, the general population rated user adoption as the highest success value. And those folks in the leadership quadrant ranked it lowest among the five here. There were more, by the way, but I've given you the top five. It is intriguing to see the different perspective. Getting it done on time is something that leaders focus on. Ensuring they hit the regulatory requirements is something that the leaders are focusing on, to a much greater degree than the folks who haven't gotten there yet. This is the power of experience. It's worth looking at, and it's one of the reasons we're so proud of this particular research. There are a couple of different kinds of research in the analyst business. Some of it suffers from what people who think about cognitive errors like to call confirmation bias. You start the study with the decision already made. You go find the evidence that supports it, and a couple of user cases that do too. We tried very hard in this research not to come in with presuppositions. We asked the questions, and much of the data that we got back, in fact, surprised us. And for me, that's a successful research project. In fact, the most successful research project tees up the next one because it raises questions that you really want to answer and can't from the data that you've already got. So, language models. Very, very important topic. All the talk, of course, is about LLMs. But the reality is that LLMs are general, that they are not going to be specific when you get into highly specialized areas of project coverage. The most obvious, and it always is in any IT adoption, is financial services, right? Those guys spend money before anybody else does. They're always looking for even a short-term advantage, and so they investigate these things very deeply. And not surprisingly, lots of work is going into domain-specific language models for finance. Beyond the do the books balance? How do we do portfolio risk assessment? What's a good hedging strategy? These are topics that the largest and most successful financial services organizations have invested very heavily in, and often the crown jewels of their organization's IT architecture are very, very opaque black boxes that give magic answers that the traders use in their everyday work. So making sure that we can adopt this new technology there is a very, very high priority for those organizations. The likelihood is here that there will be two classes of finance-specific domain language models, some of which, not surprisingly, will be very closed, and others, which are really common to everybody, hopefully will be open, often developed as open source. There is, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, an enormous component of open source contribution in this category. A lot of these models are in fact open source and wide open. If you want to go dig in, you can do a lot to improve, hopefully, what you're working with by making your own contributions. Also, note that the leaders, rank this high like everybody else did, as well as code itself. For perhaps the first time in many years, a significant technology advancement in IT is being implemented very early on the business of IT itself. So a lot of AI is being applied to the tools we use. How do we manage those tools? The platforms, the IDEs that we write code in, the language models themselves. We are turning this new technology onto itself And one thing I often say to people is this is largely going to be the IT revolution that creates itself. Increasingly, a lot of the everyday work is going to be done by the tools themselves once we're ready to turn them loose. And that's going to dramatically enhance productivity. A lot of the vendors are investing very heavily in this because they see a way to eliminate a lot of the mundane work of writing code harnesses, the real basic plumbing stuff that is just grunt work and in fact can be left to a highly intelligent AI model that understands how to set up instances and how to manage storage and so on. We're going to see a great deal of that. Specific science language models, again, not surprisingly, very advanced organizations and academia are getting into scientific models. This is going to allow us to do some very, very good crunch-intensive work in fields that really have a lot of just basic grinding to do long before we get to any sort of useful analysis. And perhaps we'll accelerate things. You think about genetic analysis. You think about pharma and the work they have to do to create new things. Much of that is very mechanical and can in fact be automated by a smart model. Two places where the leaders are focusing a little bit more than the general population, also down here at the bottom of the chart, that gratified me, frankly, were first of all the whole legal side. We're going to need to spend time on this, and it is a very specialized and very distributed specialized space because the law in one geography or in one country or in one industry can be very different than the law in another. And climate. Increasingly, organizations are very conscious of exactly how much resource consumption matters in this new world. And you know what? We're going to build an awful lot of capacity to run these models. It's no accident that all of the cloud platform vendors have already started investigating nuclear reactors to power their infrastructure, because otherwise they're going to burn an awful lot of carbon emissions in order to do this, and that would reverse the progress that they've been making for some years. So there'll be a significant bump, I think, in the effectiveness of climate, and hopefully it will be to the benefit of all industries. So at the end of the day, it won't be one model ruling them all, and in fact, there's already significant discussion going on about how will models talk to one another when they have to collaborate? And they will. Almost everything you do will have to talk to legal. And if you're building it, you're probably going to want to use the code stuff. Well, how are we going to govern across all this? And we haven't made governance a major topic in this discussion. It could be, it should be, in many ways. But how we govern is going to be a distributed governance model, because we're going to have a lot of different moving parts that were independently created, maybe independently sourced. We're going to need to know how they work together, and we will have to create some way of managing and governing and developing a multi-model environment going forward. So those are the big topics. In the interest of time, I kept it to 5. There are some things you can take away from this in terms of what your journey ought to look like. If you want to succeed, you do have to have an architecture strategy. This is not business as usual. Some of these things are very different. You need to understand where your resources are going to come from. There's a whole section of the study that says, are you working with SIs? Are you doing this internally? Are you going to your technology vendors? All of the above, of course, but how are you going to make those decisions will be very important. What choices you make in technology. These are not things to default into. As an analyst, I was watching the data warehouse market when we moved to the cloud, and everybody, of course, who follows that market knows how, for example, Snowflake suddenly exploded on the market and became an enormous player. And how many of the customers that chose them that I talked to in those years, when asked the question, who else did you look at, responded, nobody, was rather disturbing. Don't fall into that trap this time. Look around. Do some comparisons. Talk to your providers of research. Absolutely. Talk to your peers. Make sure that you're not leaping in without careful assessment of the alternatives. Think about what those criteria are going to be when you make those selections. Think carefully about what models you need, and don't grab the first one that works. Try a few of them. They do vary, and it's not just about size. It is about how they were implemented. And absolutely critical, do not leave responsible AI out of your thinking. This is going to be the most disruptive implementation of new technology that we've seen in a long time. And it is going to be in many ways more opaque than some of the ones in the past, at the same time as we lean on it more directly to make decisions for us. If we don't have those guidelines understood, if we haven't ensured observability, explainability, then there are very, very great risks associated with that. The QR code on your screen here will take you to the full survey, which you can download. It's a couple of dozen pages and has a lot more questions in it than we've talked about here. And with that, I will say thank you very much. And no, that's not my picture. If you haven't already been looking at me on screen, I don't look like that. Maybe in a few years when I upload myself into the cloud, I will, but we'll see if that happens. Thank you again for your time. And that's the conclusion of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Merv. Fantastic presentation, and thank you for putting up the QR code there as well for everyone to see. I think that's great. We do have a few questions here, so let me dive into those.
And hopefully a few answers. Yeah.
Yes. So looking at the high readiness cohort that you spoke about in the beginning of the presentation there, and you said that they got over the first hills. Do you know how they got over those first hills? Did they dive head first into it, failed fast and learned, or how did they get over there?
Great question. I think essentially that the rest of the survey and some of the questions that we talked about here and a whole lot of other ones help to answer that question. We saw a great deal of thoughtfulness about train versus farm it out. Farm it out to big SIs or specialist ones or even regional ones, actually. That was kind of interesting. There was a predisposition to working with local providers they were already familiar with, rather than just defaulting to, let's go to the biggest SI we know. I won't name any names, because you know what? They're not any farther along necessarily. And it's a good question to ask, although we didn't discuss it in the survey. Find out about the experience of any providers you're bringing in. This is new enough that you might just be their pilot. So be careful.
So following up on that, you talked about the high readiness cohort's number one obstacle as well. So high cost and budget limitations. So you mentioned that in the previous answer too. So do you think that's mostly based on the notion that you need to train your own model, or is it more spread across all the aspects of AI, looking at infrastructure, cooling, power, all of those things?
All of the above, I guess, is the right answer here. Hang on, let me jump over to that slide. Let's see, where was it? Here, I think. Yeah. Yep. So we gave them a list, and you see it here. There are more, and I think we're going to include a little bit more of a free text box for people to tell us other and collect that this time. Remember, we said readiness. These are folks who've self-identified as having done these things. So they're looking at these questions. How well that informed or improved the result is not really the topic of this research. But it is the topic of the next one. So, so stay tuned. Hopefully we'll be publishing that, by the end of the first quarter of next year. The survey will get fielded as the last one did towards the end of the year, and all the crunching will be done in Q1. This time around, we're going to be looking for people who have put something into production. We're going to ask them many of the same questions, but of course the twist is now, how's that going? How did that work for you? And I think we're going to learn a lot. What clearly the question you're asking and the answer that we have is perhaps the first taste of what that means. Anybody who'd gone this far down the road decided that they didn't really understand going in how much it was going to cost them. And we haven't dug in deeper to what the components of that cost are, but that's a plan. So we'll have more to say. I think, though, you can do a lot with literally cost-free tools right now, but you got to run it somewhere. And turns out that the costs of running these things is quite large. And many organizations have opted in their data strategy, and this is a big one, and very relevant to Vast's customers, by the way. Many people have opted to make another copy of the data because they're nervous. That's very costly. And if you happen to have a data environment that can support multiple workloads, including these new ones, without making extra copies or blowing up the expense of doing so, that's a really useful base thing to do. And it's a good thing to talk to your friends at Vast about.
Yeah. I have another question here from Brian. The huge surprise for me was the delta in the user adoption as a priority. Do you have any intuition on the reason for this?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that successful organizations that are responsible for developing software tend to have is a focus on the deliverable itself, its timeliness and its quality. And user experience is often secondary under those circumstances. I'm not suggesting it's the correct perspective, by the way, but for the first project where you're not yet into the mission critical thing the whole company's going to run on, but you're kind of piloting, I don't think it's unreasonable to push UX down a little bit and let some of the learning from that first rollout be, oh, users don't like it when we do it this way. We need to change that next time. It's the fact that the models are running, that they're giving demonstrably correct and observable answers that's going to matter the first time out. So I'm kind of in sympathy with that response, frankly. Great question, Brian. Thank you.
Another question here. So, and this ties really well into what you were just saying, looking at risk management and running your business on this. What's your view on basing business decisions in public statements on information gathered through current AI technology? Do you look at trust but verify, or how do you see it?
Proceed with caution, I suppose. I think we're going to want to have a little experience under our belt before we are comfortable stepping away and letting the machine do the work. It's not yet time for our new machine overlords. I don't think any of this stuff should be done without human supervision yet. And at a granular level farther down the stack, once we have been able to assure ourselves of the accuracy of what we're getting out, we may begin to turn over some decisions based on that. But that's a two-step process. It's first going to be about, is it right? And then it's going to be about what we do about it. And we are not using these things yet to make decisions as much as we are using them to provide us with information and analysis. It still takes a human to decide, what does that mean in terms of my strategy? What does that mean in terms of my exposure? What does it mean in terms of my willingness to accept risk? And yes, you can model those things and quantify them. And you could have a system that is making preliminary decisions for you. I would not be advising anybody to turn it over to them yet. keep thinking about Hal in 2001 saying, "I'm sorry, Dave, I don't think I can do that." You know.
Yep. That's great. That's great. Got another question here from Jim. Hi, Merv. You touched on the legal and regulation aspect a bit in the survey. How do you think this will shake out in the near term? Are there any key gaps in your view? And do you think we'll have different approaches to regulation based on geography or jurisdiction? It's a lot for companies to consider.
Jim, that's a very, very critical question, and one that I would answer very profanely if we were just sitting in a bar. It's going to be a mess. You can imagine the word I would probably have used instead. It's going to be a mess because it's going to happen at different rates, and it's going to happen in different places. Different agencies are going to have different approaches to it. Different industries are going to have different approaches to it. Different governments are going to have different approaches to it. And a global organization is going to have to deal with all of them simultaneously and reconcile those differences. So it's frightening. You cannot just assume that we'll sort it out later with the lawyers, because the stakes are going to be very high. We're going to be placing reliance on these systems in very central business critical places. And if we get it wrong legally, we're going to be very, very vulnerable, especially in a state where the legalities have not been clearly defined. And it's even more difficult in some places where they have been, and notably in Europe, where some regulations exist that are virtually impossible to comply with because the people who wrote them have no idea what it will take to do what they're asking. So, as usual, the law lags innovation and technology, and it's going to be a delicate process. And then that's another reason why the point I made earlier about the necessity of human participation in all this is going to be so important. We may come back with something that we're very satisfied out of our new system, and it might look very attractive, and it might have great returns on investment, and it may seem pretty low risk. And somebody's going to sit back in their chair and say, yeah, but we know the guys that regulate this industry. There's just no way they're going to let this happen. They're going to see it as anti-competitive, or whatever the reason is. That instinct is going to be really, really critical. So it's going to be a big mess for a long time. And by the way, the lawyers are going to make a lot of money on language models and AI-based systems.
Got a question here from Hamid. What is your view of co-pilots, particularly with business processing connecting to back-end warehouse to answer analytic questions? Will it be able to go beyond simple questions?
Yes, Hamid, I do know you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for asking the question. It's one of the most obvious places for dramatic improvement very soon. Look, I think BI, for vendors has been the gift that keeps on giving for decades, right? You'd think with all the innovation and product introduction that we've been doing decade after decade after decade in BI, how come we haven't got it right yet? And the answer is because the goalposts keep moving. We keep answering harder and harder questions, but in an era where more and more of the data that we are going to use for the more expansive questions we want to ask is going to be living outside those highly optimized stores that you're referring to when you refer to data warehouses, we're going to need some help understanding how to interpret that other data. We're going to need some help understanding when it seems to conflict with what we thought we already knew and whether we should accept these differences or not, and how to do, frankly, dialogues. And this is happening now already. I mean, some of these assistants are really good at understanding the second and third question in the context of the first, right? Okay, I see that, but what does it mean in Europe? Or, well, what if I look at only the products that are deliverable in multiple sizes, or, any of those follow-on questions, but also to come back and generate some fairly typical analytical questions based on a variety of well-understood analytic methodologies, and prompting the user to say, A fairly typical answer, or excuse me, a fairly typical question in this kind of analysis is to segment it by age, or, here it is, literally presented to me right away and say, it looks like there is a significant variance from the norm right here. Would you like to go explore that further? We're going to see a ton of that. And we already are seeing a ton of it. And it's one of the most exciting things about this development, frankly. Thank you for that question.
That's a really good answer as well.
Thank you.
We have one last question, and then I think we're going to wrap it up here. So next week, we have a session on AI ethics and compliance. So what are some of your thoughts about responsible AI priorities?
Oh, how much time have we got?
Easy question.
Yeah, it is a topic unto itself. I'm glad you're doing a whole session on it. I think the first and most important thing, and it's not often discussed, is whether or not your organization already has a set of clearly defined ethical boundaries that will be implemented in this new technology. God help you if it's the first time you're thinking about it, but if it's the catalyst, so be it. But don't limit your thinking to what about this system. Push it as high as you can. And by the way, this is a great way to show those guys in the board that I talked about earlier who want you to be doing this, to get them involved, to go back to them and say, before we go down this path, how do we feel about this particular ethical question? How do we feel about the bias in our models? How hard do you want us to work to ensure racial, income-based, geographically based, religious-based, biases are eliminated? How much advantage do we want to give to our best customers or our best trading partners? All sorts of very, very fundamental questions about how you choose to do business may be understood in the organization, at least they may think they're understood. But the degree to which they're reified in actual regulatory guidelines within the organization itself may be lacking, and that may be one of the first things you have to do to get that done. And this is a specialty. Ethicists are professionals who understand the issue very well. And if you don't have one, find one. You might be hiring them, or you might just be consulting with them. But it is definitely a topic that needs to be at the very top of your list. Great question. And I'm going to see if I can get onto that call and listen to it.
Sounds great. Thank you so much again, Merv. This has been a fantastic presentation, stellar Q&A as well. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone who joined. Just a super, super fun presentation today.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Have a good one. Bye.
Ah.